The morning of October 11th, 1943, over Wewak, New Guinea, Colonel Neil Kirby banked his P-47 Thunderbolt hard left, watching 40 Japanese fighters swarm into the sky below him. His fuel gauges showed he should already be turning for home. His assigned reconnaissance mission was complete. Every tactical manual written to the United States Army Air Forces would tell him to break contact and preserve his four-ship formation for another day. But Kirby had spent 18 months learning to fly the most controversial fighter aircraft in the Pacific Theater, a 7-ton monster that nearly everyone except him believed was completely unsuited for combat against Japanese fighters. And now, staring down at 12 enemy bombers, escorted by 36 fighters, he was about to prove that 8 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously could rewrite the fundamental assumptions about what constituted lethal firepower in aerial combat. He keyed his radio and spoke 4 words that would earn him the Medal of Honor and set a United States Army Air Forces record that would stand for a year. "We're going in. Follow me." The problem with American fighter aircraft in 1942 wasn't that the engineering was inferior. It was that American designers had been building fighters optimized for the wrong war. Throughout the 1930s, Army Air Corps doctrine emphasized the pursuit role, fast, lightweight interceptors designed to climb quickly and engage enemy bombers at high altitude. The lightweight Seversky P-35, the streamlined Curtiss P-40, and even the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 all reflected this philosophy. Speed and maneuverability mattered more than protection or firepower. American fighters carried 4 to 6 machine guns, adequate armament by pre-war standards, and relied on agility to survive combat with enemy fighters. Then the war in Europe revealed that this doctrine was obsolete before American pilots ever engaged the enemy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German fighters in 1940 demonstrated capabilities that shocked American observers. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 carried cannon that could destroy bombers with short bursts. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 featured armor protection that allowed German pilots to press attacks through defensive fire. British Spitfires engaging these fighters over the Channel learned that survival required not just speed, but also structural durability and concentrated firepower. Intelligence reports flowing back to Wright Field in Ohio during the Battle of Britain painted a consistent picture. Future air combat would occur at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where thin air limited engine performance. Fighter pilots would need armor protection to survive increasingly lethal weapons. And most critically, effective fighters would require enough firepower to destroy heavily armored opponents before those opponents could return fire. Alexander Kartveli, chief engineer at Republic Aviation Corporation in Farmingdale, New York, read these reports in spring 1940 with growing frustration. His company had been developing the XP-44 rocket, an improved version of the P-43 Lancer that Republic believed would meet Army Air Corps specifications. The XP-44 featured a supercharged Pratt & Whitney radial engine, retractable landing gear, and armament of 6 50-caliber machine guns. It was a conventional design, an evolutionary improvement over existing American fighters. And according to the intelligence from Europe, it was completely inadequate. The Army Air Corps agreed. In June 1940, Republic received notification that both the XP-44 and a lightweight design designated XP-47A were being cancelled. The specifications had changed. The new requirements demanded capabilities that no existing American fighter possessed. The aircraft would need to operate effectively above 30,000 feet, where most fighters of that era struggled to maintain speed and maneuverability. It would require armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks to survive combat damage. Most significantly, it would carry at least 8 50-caliber Browning AN-M2 machine guns, more firepower than any single-engine American fighter had ever mounted. The ammunition load would exceed 3,000 rounds, enough for sustained combat without running dry at critical moments. And it would need to deliver all this capability in a package that could still match or exceed the performance of German and Japanese fighters. No one at Republic Aviation thought the requirements were achievable. Kartveli thought they were merely very difficult. According to accounts preserved in Republic Aviation records, Kartveli learned of the cancellations while visiting Wright Field. He boarded a train back to New York that evening, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began sketching a fighter aircraft unlike anything he had designed before. The airplane would be enormous by fighter standards, heavy enough when fully loaded to exceed the weight of some medium bombers. It would be built around the most powerful aircraft engine ever produced in the United States, the 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that generated enough torque to require a four-bladed propeller 12 feet in diameter, and it would incorporate a turbo-supercharger system so complex and so unconventional that it would define the aircraft's entire design philosophy. Traditional fighters mounted their superchargers close to the engine, using mechanical drives or short ducting to compress air into the carburetor. Kartveli's design would position the turbo supercharger in the rear fuselage, nearly 10 feet behind the engine. Exhaust gases would travel through pipes running along each side of the cockpit to spin the turbine, and compressed air would flow forward through ducts to feed the engine. The arrangement seemed absurd. The ducting alone would add hundreds of pounds to the aircraft's weight and create drag that would reduce performance, but it offered advantages that Kartveli considered decisive. The supercharger, positioned in the fuselage belly between the cockpit and tail, would be protected from battle damage that would cripple conventionally supercharged fighters. The long exhaust pipes would cool gases before they reached the turbine, increasing efficiency. And most importantly, the system would deliver consistent boost across a wide altitude range, giving the fighter performance at 40,000 feet that other aircraft couldn't match at half that altitude. The design Kartveli submitted to the Army Air Corps on June 12, 1940, designated XP-47B, represented a complete departure from American fighter philosophy. The aircraft would weigh 9,900 pounds empty, 65% heavier than the P-43 Lancer it was meant to replace. With fuel, ammunition, and pilot, combat weight would exceed 15,000 pounds. For comparison, the Spitfire Mark V, which British pilots were then flying against the Luftwaffe, weighed 5,700 pounds, fully loaded. The P-47 would be nearly 3 times heavier than the British fighter and substantially heavier than many twin-engine aircraft. Army Air Corps officers reviewing the proposal expressed skepticism that bordered on disbelief. Kartveli's response, preserved in Republic Aviation documents, captured both the audacity and the pragmatism of his approach. "It will be a dinosaur," he told Army evaluators, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The Army Air Corps ordered a prototype on September 6, 1940. 1 week later, on September 13th, they ordered 171 production P-47Bs and 602 P-47Cs before a single aircraft had flown. The contract value was $56,499,924, an enormous investment in an untested design. But the intelligence from Europe was worsening daily. The Battle of Britain had demonstrated that fighter command survival depended on aircraft capable of sustained combat at high altitude. German bombers were ranging across England with escorts that British fighters struggled to intercept. The United States would soon enter the war, and when it did, American pilots would need fighters capable of matching or exceeding anything the Luftwaffe could field. The Army Air Corps was betting that Kartveli could deliver that capability. The question was whether a fighter weighing as much as some bombers could actually fight. Construction of the XP-47B prototype began at Republic's Farmingdale facility in fall 1940. The challenges became apparent immediately. The 8.50 caliber Browning machine, guns 4 in each wing, weighed 350 pounds without ammunition. Each gun required 350 rounds in a side-by-side ammunition box, adding another 500 pounds per wing. The guns were staggered in the wings to allow feeding from adjacent ammunition boxes without interference, creating a complex mounting system that required careful engineering to handle firing stresses. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they would generate recoil forces exceeding 2,000 pounds. The wings needed to be strong enough to absorb these loads without structural failure or excessive vibration that would scatter the fire pattern and reduce accuracy. The propeller presented equally difficult problems. A conventional 3-bladed propeller could not efficiently convert 2,000 horsepower into thrust. Cartveli specified a 4-bladed Curtiss electric constant-speed propeller 146 inches in diameter, nearly 12.5 feet from tip to tip. At that diameter, the propeller required exceptional ground clearance to avoid striking the runway during takeoff and landing. A conventional landing gear would need to be so long that the attachments would fall outside the wing structure, exactly where the machine guns and ammunition needed to be located. Cartveli's solution was characteristically unconventional. He designed telescopic landing gear struts that extended 9 inches when the gear deployed. In flight, the struts retracted to their shorter length, reducing the space required inside the wing and allowing room for the guns and ammunition. The mechanism added weight and complexity, but it solved an otherwise insoluble geometric problem. The first flight of the P-47B occurred on May 6, 1941, just 8 months after the prototype was ordered. Test pilot Lowry Brabham took off from Republic's Grass Airfield at Farmingdale and immediately transitioned to the paved runway at nearby Mitchell Field. The flight lasted only a few minutes, long enough to confirm that the aircraft could fly and that no immediate problems threatened pilot safety. Minor issues appeared: cockpit smoke from an oil drip, vibration in the control surfaces, difficulty opening the hinged canopy, but the basic design proved sound. Over the following months, test flights revealed performance that exceeded Army Air Corps specifications. At 25,800 feet, with the turbo supercharger delivering full boost, the prototype achieved 412 miles per hour. At 15,000 feet, it could climb from sea level in 5 minutes. The rate of fire from 8 machine guns reached 100 rounds per second, or 6,000 rounds per minute, delivering a weight of fire that no other American single-engine fighter could match. But the aircraft also revealed characteristics that would shape its combat employment throughout the war. Rate of climb was the slowest of any American fighter, where a Spitfire could reach 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes and a P-51 in 8 minutes. The P-47 required nearly 12 minutes to reach 30,000 feet. The aircraft was heavy enough that turning performance, while adequate, lagged behind lighter fighters. German pilots engaging P-47's quickly learned that tight turns could neutralize the American fighter's speed advantage, forcing the Thunderbolt pilot to disengage or risk losing energy and becoming an easy target. But in the dive, no piston-engine fighter in the world could match the P-47. The massive weight that handicapped climb and turn performance became an overwhelming advantage when diving. P-47's could exceed 500 miles per hour in a steep dive, building speed faster than any German or Japanese fighter could follow. And when diving, the P-47 maintained control authority and structural integrity that lighter fighters lacked. German fighters attempting to follow a diving Thunderbolt often experienced control surface flutter or structural failure that ended the pursuit more effectively than any defensive maneuver. The firepower advantage was even more pronounced. A 5-second burst from all 8 guns would fire 400 rounds, placing approximately half of them, 200 bullets, in a 3-foot by 3-foot area at 1,100 feet range. The standard ammunition load mixed M2 ball rounds, M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, and M10 tracer rounds. The M8 rounds were particularly devastating. Each contained a small pyrotechnic charge that ignited on impact, burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum and ignite fuel or hydraulic lines. German and Japanese aircraft hit by concentrated fire from a P-47 didn't just suffer damage, they disintegrated. Pilots who survived. Encounters with Thunderbolts reported that aircraft struck by the 8-gun battery simply came apart in the air, wings separating from fuselages, engines torn from mounts, control surfaces shredded by the concentrated fire. By December 1941, when the United States entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor, production P-47Bs were beginning to roll off Republic's assembly line. The first operational aircraft were delivered to the 56th Fighter Group in June 1942. Pilots transitioning from lighter fighters to the P-47 experienced what many described as culture shock. The cockpit, while comfortable and well-appointed, sat atop a fuselage so large that pilots joked they could defend themselves in combat by running around inside and hiding from enemy fighters. Taking off required attention to technique because the massive torque from the 2,000 horsepower engine and the heavy weight meant any pilot error during rotation could ground loop the aircraft or cause loss of control. Landing was equally demanding because the weight carried momentum that made stopping distances longer and any misjudgment of approach speed dangerous. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, became the testbed for P-47 combat doctrine. Zemke, who had served as a combat observer with the Royal Air Force in 1940 and had studied Luftwaffe tactics over Britain, understood immediately that the Thunderbolt could not fight like a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. The P-47's advantages lay in altitude performance, diving speed, and overwhelming firepower. Zemke developed tactics built around these strengths, formations that positioned P-47s above German fighters, bounce attacks, using diving speed to engage and disengage before the enemy could react, and coordinated fire from multiple aircraft to maximize the effect of the 8-gun batteries. The tactics worked, but they required discipline and training that took months to perfect. In January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group deployed to England, operating from Horsham St. Faith near Norwich. They would be followed by the 4th Fighter Group in March, the 78th Fighter Group in April, and eventually by 15 P-47 groups operating with the 8th Air Force. Their mission was to escort Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers on daylight raids into occupied Europe and eventually Germany itself. The strategic bombing campaign depended on effective fighter escort. Without it, bomber losses would be unsustainable. And in early 1943, effective long-range escort fighters did not exist. The P-47 would have to prove it could protect the bombers, or the entire daylight bombing strategy would collapse. The first combat mission occurred on March 10, 1943, when the 4th Fighter Group flew a fighter sweep over France. The mission failed due to radio malfunctions, and the entire P-47 force returned without engaging enemy aircraft. After refitting with British radios, missions resumed on April 8th. 1 week later, on April 15th, Major Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group scored the P-47's first aerial victory, destroying a Focke-Wulf FW-190 over the French coast. The kill confirmed that the Thunderbolt could engage German fighters successfully, but it did not resolve the fundamental question: could a fighter as heavy and as unconventional as the P-47 actually dominate aerial combat against experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying lighter, more maneuverable aircraft? The answer would come from battles fought at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine delivered performance that German fighters could not match. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German pilots encountering P-47s in spring and summer 1943 initially treated the bulky American fighters with something approaching contempt. Luftwaffe tactical reports from April through June 1943, preserved in captured documents now held at the National Archives, describe the P-47 as heavy, sluggish in turns, and vulnerable to the standard Luftwaffe tactic of pulling into a steep climb that lighter German fighters could follow, but American fighters could not. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf, FW-190 pilots, reported that engaging P-47's at altitudes below 20,000 feet gave German fighters decisive advantages. The Americans were faster in level flight and formidable in dives, but they could be defeated by exploiting their poor climb rate and mediocre turning performance. This assessment was accurate as far as it went. The problem for the Luftwaffe was that it didn't go far enough. American doctrine didn't call for P-47's to fight below 20,000 feet. The Thunderbolt was designed as a high-altitude interceptor, and at altitudes above 25,000 feet, the performance equation reversed completely. The turbo supercharger that added so much weight and complexity to the P-47's design delivered consistent boost pressure regardless of altitude. At 30,000 feet, where German fighters struggled to maintain speed and maneuverability in thin air, P-47's operated with power and control authority that no Luftwaffe fighter could match. German pilots who attempted to climb away from P-47's at high altitude found themselves in a fight they couldn't win. The Americans could follow them into any climb, maintain speed through vertical maneuvers that would stall German fighters, and deliver devastating firepower from 8 machine guns that remained effective at ranges where German cannon and machine gun fire scattered uselessly. The psychological impact of the P-47's firepower became apparent in June 1943 when Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group survived an encounter that would define the Thunderbolt's reputation for durability. On June 26th, Johnson's P-47 was attacked by German fighters over France. His aircraft took more than 200 hits. Cannon shells shredded the left-wing root and fuselage. Machine gun fire destroyed the hydraulic system, jammed the canopy and punctured the fuel tanks. Johnson remained conscious despite wounds and managed to keep the crippled fighter airborne through violent maneuvers that would have torn apart a lighter aircraft. A German pilot, identified in post-war accounts as Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, reportedly pulled alongside Johnson's shattered P-47, saw the extent of the damage, and flew away without firing again. Whether Meyer saluted, as some accounts claim, or simply recognized that shooting at Johnson further would accomplish nothing, remains unclear. What was undeniable was that Johnson brought his P-47 back to England and landed successfully despite damage that should have destroyed the aircraft in mid-air. The incident was documented in 56th Fighter Group records and photographed extensively after Johnson landed. The photographs show a fighter that appears to have been hit by concentrated anti-aircraft fire, with holes and tears covering nearly every surface. That an aircraft could sustain such damage and continue flying changed how both American and German pilots thought about the P-47's combat survivability. American pilots gained confidence that their aircraft could absorb punishment and bring them home. German pilots learned that destroying a P-47 required either a catastrophic hit on a vital system or sustained fire that few combat situations allowed time to deliver. The Thunderbolt's reputation as an aircraft that could take incredible damage and keep flying became one of its most significant psychological weapons. Pilots who believed their aircraft could survive hits that would destroy other fighters pressed attacks more aggressively and disengaged less readily when damaged. By October 1943, P-47's were operating not just in Europe but also in the Pacific Theater, where the Thunderbolt faced a completely different set of tactical challenges. Japanese fighters, particularly the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, known to American pilots as the Oscar, were even lighter and more maneuverable than German fighters. The Ki-43 weighed less than 5,000 pounds fully loaded, less than half the combat weight of a P-47. In turning fights at medium altitudes, Japanese pilots could outturn American fighters so decisively that dogfighting became effectively suicidal for P-47 pilots. The standard Japanese tactic against heavy American fighters was to force a turning engagement, drain the Americans' energy through sustained maneuvering, and then attack when the heavier fighter lost speed and became vulnerable. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group in New Guinea, understood these limitations better than most American pilots in the Pacific. Kirby was 32 years old in October 1943, ancient by fighter pilot standards. and he brought a maturity and tactical sophistication to P-47 operations that younger pilots often lacked. He had trained his group intensively on boom and zoom tactics, diving attacks that used the P-47's superior speed and firepower to engage Japanese fighters before they could force a turning fight. The doctrine emphasized altitude advantage, diving speed, accurate gunnery, and immediate disengagement after each pass. Kirby's pilots learned to resist the temptation to turn with Japanese fighters, no matter how advantageous the situation appeared. One turn became two, two became three, and three became a flat scissors that inevitably favored the lighter, more agile Japanese aircraft. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led a four-ship reconnaissance mission over Japanese airfields at Wewak on the northern coast of New Guinea. The mission was routine: survey Japanese installations, count aircraft, assess activity levels, and return with intelligence that would inform future bombing raids. Kirby's flight completed the reconnaissance without incident, photographing four airfields and observing significant Japanese reinforcements. Fuel was running low. Standard procedure called for immediate return to base. Then Kirby spotted a single Japanese fighter below his formation. The fighter appeared to be a straggler, possibly damaged, flying alone and vulnerable. Every instinct developed through months of training told Kirby that attacking a lone target while low on fuel over enemy territory violated basic tactical doctrine. But the target was perfect, below him, unaware of his presence, and positioned for a diving attack that would use all of the P-47's advantages. He rolled into a dive, close to firing range, and destroyed the Japanese fighter with a single burst. The enemy aircraft exploded and fell in flames. The attack revealed Kirby's formation to approximately 48 Japanese aircraft, 12 bombers escorted by 36 fighters that had been invisible from higher altitude. The Japanese formation was assembling for a raid on Allied positions, and Kirby's four P-47's had inadvertently positioned themselves perfectly to intercept. The tactical situation was objectively insane. 4 American fighters against 48 Japanese aircraft, numerical odds of 12-1. Fuel low enough that extended combat would leave insufficient reserves to reach base. Mission complete, meaning that the staying to fight served no operational purpose. The Medal of Honor citation that would later describe this moment would note all of these factors and then state simply that Kirby gave the signal to attack. The engagement that followed lasted approximately 1 hour, though participants' accounts vary on exact timing. What is undisputed is that Kirby dove into the midst of the Japanese formation and destroyed 3 aircraft in quick succession. The attacks used classic boom and zoom technique, diving passes that built speed to over 400 miles per hour, short bursts from 8 machine guns that tore apart lightly built Japanese aircraft, and immediate climbs back to altitude using energy from the dive. Japanese fighters attempted to engage, but at the speeds Kirby was generating, they couldn't turn tightly enough to track his P-47 through the firing solution. He'd say he was simply moving too fast for Japanese pilots trained on slower, more maneuverable aircraft to compensate their aim properly. Kirby then observed one of his wingmen, Captain William Dunham, with 2 Japanese fighters in pursuit. The Japanese pilots had positioned themselves perfectly for a kill, closing to short range where their lighter armament would be effective against the P-47's armor and structure. Kirby reversed his climb, dove back into the combat, and destroyed both Japanese fighters before they could fire on Dunham. The gunnery required to execute these attacks exceeded normal standards for aerial combat accuracy. Kirby was engaging targets while maneuvering at high speed in 3 dimensions, compensating for relative motion, bullet trajectory, and deflection, all while managing his own aircraft's energy state to maintain the speed advantage that kept him alive. That he destroyed both fighters without extended bursts suggests a level of marksmanship that few pilots in any air force achieved. The Japanese formation, having lost 5 aircraft in minutes, broke off and attempted to attack Kirby's P-47 with multiple aircraft simultaneously. Standard Japanese doctrine called for coordinated attacks from different angles to force the target aircraft into a defensive maneuver that would sacrifice energy and create opportunities for follow-up attacks. Against lighter American fighters like the P-40 or P-39, this tactic was often effective. Against Kirby in a P-47 at high altitude, it was suicide. He made one more pass through the Japanese formation, destroyed a sixth aircraft, and then climbed into the cloud cover that provided protection while he aggressed the combat area. His 3 wingmen accounted for 3 additional Japanese kills, bringing the total to 9 Japanese aircraft destroyed without American losses. Kirby had personally destroyed 6, setting a United States Army Air Force's record for most victories in a single mission. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force in the Pacific, recommended Kirby for the Medal of Honor immediately upon hearing the mission debrief. The recommendation was approved, and General Douglas MacArthur himself presented the medal to Kirby at a ceremony in Brisbane, Australia, in January 1944. The citation emphasized Kirby's gallantry and the tactical absurdity of attacking, despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage and low fuel. What it didn't emphasize, because it was classified at the time, was how completely the engagement validated the P-47's design philosophy, a fighter built around high-altitude performance, diving speed, and concentrated firepower, had defeated a numerically superior force of lighter, more maneuverable opponents by exploiting exactly the advantages that Alexander Kartveli had designed into the aircraft 3 years earlier. The effectiveness of the P-47's 8 machine guns became even more apparent in spring 1944 when 9th Air Force P-47 groups transitioned from bomber escort to ground attack missions in preparation for the Normandy invasion. Ground attack had never been part of the original P-47 mission profile. The aircraft had been designed as a high-altitude interceptor, and its weight and size made it seem unsuited for low-level operations where speed and maneuverability mattered more than altitude performance. But the requirements of the invasion changed tactical priorities. Allied planners needed fighter bombers capable of destroying German armor, vehicles, and fortified positions in direct support of advancing ground forces. The P-47's durability, heavy armament, and ability to carry substantial bomb loads made it the logical choice, despite its unconventional characteristics, for ground attack work. Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group pioneered P-47 strafing tactics in March 1944. Duncan was a Texas-born fighter pilot whose aggressive leadership style and willingness to experiment with unconventional tactics made him both respected and feared by pilots in his group. He persuaded 8th Air Force commanders to authorize operational testing of low-level strafing attacks against German ground targets, arguing that the P-47's 8 guns and armor protection would prove effective against vehicles and troop concentrations. The testing validated his arguments. P-47s flying at low altitude between 50 and 500 feet above the ground could approach targets with minimal warning, deliver devastating fire from 8 machine guns, and survive return fire that would destroy lighter fighters. The 8 50-caliber guns that had been designed for aerial combat proved equally effective against ground targets. Each gun fired between 600 and 800 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,900 feet per second. The combined rate of fire from all 8 guns exceeded 100 rounds per second. A 2-second burst would place 200 bullets into a target area roughly 6 feet wide, at typical strafing ranges of 300 to 500 yards. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds were particularly devastating against vehicles. The rounds could penetrate the thin armor on German half-track and truck engines, and the incendiary charge would ignite fuel, oil, or hydraulic fluid. German tank crews discovered that strafing attacks from above could penetrate the engine deck, grating on Panzer IV and Panther tanks, causing engine fires that disabled the vehicles even when the armor itself wasn't penetrated. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, 36 P-47 groups from 8th and 9th Air Force flew continuous missions over Normandy, attacking German positions, vehicle columns, and troop concentrations. The Luftwaffe, which had been husbanded for months to preserve strength for defense of Germany itself, mounted minimal resistance. German fighter pilots who did engage Allied aircraft over Normandy found themselves outnumbered by factors of 10 to 1 or more, facing not just P-47's, but also P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and British Spitfires and Typhoons. The aerial battle was less a fight than a massacre. German pilots who survived combat over Normandy in June and July 1944 reported that American fighters were effectively omnipresent, that any movement during daylight hours invited immediate air attack, and that the firepower from aircraft like the P-47 was unlike anything they had experienced earlier in the war. German tactical manuals from summer 1944, captured after the war and now preserved at the National Archives, include specific sections on recognizing and defending against P-47 attacks. The manuals describe the P-47's distinctive profile, the heavy sound of its Pratt & Whitney radial engine, and the telltale roar that preceded strafing attacks. Instructions emphasized dispersing forces to minimize the effectiveness of area attacks, using terrain and buildings for cover, and firing on attacking aircraft with all available weapons, including small arms. The manuals noted that P-47's were vulnerable to concentrated fire, but warned that the aircraft's armor and structure allowed it to survive hits that would destroy other fighters. Soldiers were instructed to aim for the engine and cockpit areas where damage might disable the aircraft or wound the pilot. By late summer 1944, German forces in France were retreating toward Germany under constant air attack. P-47's destroyed thousands of vehicles, trains, artillery pieces, and supply dumps during the pursuit. The official U.S. Army Air Force's history of the European campaign, compiled from operational records, credits P-47 pilots with destroying more than 7,000 enemy aircraft, with approximately half of those kills achieved in air-to-air combat and the remainder on the ground. Ground attack missions accounted for the destruction of 86,000 trucks, 9,000 locomotives, 600 armored vehicles, and thousands of other targets. These numbers, while impressive, understate the psychological impact of continuous air attack on German ground forces. Soldiers who survived the Normandy campaign and the subsequent retreat reported that air attacks created constant stress, prevented movement during daylight hours, and degraded unit cohesion as troops sought individual cover rather than maintaining formations. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided another demonstration of P-47 effectiveness under conditions that initially favored German forces. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes on December the 16th, weather conditions prevented Allied air operations for several days. Heavy cloud cover, snow, and low visibility grounded most aircraft and allowed German columns to advance with minimal air interference. German commanders had planned the offensive for winter specifically to neutralize Allied air superiority. For several days, the plan worked. German armor and infantry advanced rapidly, exploiting the weather and achieving tactical surprise that caught American forces unprepared. But weather eventually cleared, and when it did, the full weight of Allied air power fell on German columns that had advanced beyond their supply lines and were concentrated on limited road networks. P-47 groups from 9th Air Force flew constant missions, attacking German armor, trucks, and troop concentrations with bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire. On the northern shoulder of the German penetration near Elsenborn Ridge, P-47's worked in coordination with American artillery to break up German attacks before they could develop momentum. Pilots would spot German formations, call in artillery strikes, and then strafe surviving vehicles and troops. The coordination between air and ground forces was unprecedented in its effectiveness and devastating in its impact on German operations. Colonel Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group, still flying P-47's, while most 8th Air Force groups had transitioned to P-51 Mustangs, claimed 677.5 aerial victories by war's end, the highest total of any fighter group in 8th Air Force. The group's success reflected both the P-47's capabilities and Zemke's tactical doctrine that maximized the aircraft's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Zemke emphasized formation discipline, altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, and immediate disengagement after each pass. His pilots learned to resist the temptation to turn with German fighters, to maintain energy through diving attacks, and to use the P-47's firepower to destroy targets quickly rather than pursuing damaged aircraft into disadvantageous positions. In April 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany itself, P-47 pilots faced the Luftwaffe's newest and most advanced aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour in level flight. German pilots flying the jet had standing orders to avoid combat with Allied fighters and focus exclusively on bomber attacks, where the Me-262's speed and heavy cannon armament were most effective. But operational realities meant that Me-262s often encountered Allied fighters during takeoff and landing, when the jets were slow and vulnerable. P-47 pilots claimed 20 confirmed kills against Me-262s, typically by attacking the jets as they attempted to land at their bases. The tactics required patience, positioning near known Me-262 airfields, and precise gunnery to hit the fast-moving jets during the brief window when they were vulnerable. Captain John Farringer of the 63rd Fighter Squadron destroyed an Me-262 over Germany in April 1945 using tactics that exemplified P-47 doctrine. Farringer positioned his flight at high altitude near an airfield where Me-262s were known to operate. When a jet appeared, attempting to land after a mission, Farringer dove to intercept. The Me-262 pilot, focused on landing procedures, didn't see the P-47 until Farringer opened fire at 500 yards range. 8 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously generated enough firepower to damage the jet's control surfaces and engine. Smoke poured from the Me-262, and moments later, the German pilot ejected. Farringer watched the pilot descend under parachute while the jet crashed and exploded. The engagement demonstrated that even against aircraft with overwhelming speed advantages, tactics and positioning could overcome technological superiority. Major Joseph Priller, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war and was interviewed by American intelligence officers, provided one of the most candid German assessments of the P-47. Priller had flown combat missions against Allied aircraft throughout the war and had direct experience engaging P-47's over France and Germany. His post-war comments, preserved in intelligence reports now held at the National Archives, acknowledged that German pilots had initially underestimated the P-47's capabilities. "We laughed at them in 1943, Priller said. Nobody laughs now." He described the P-47 as the perfect fighter-bomber, noting that its guns never jammed, never overheated, and that the aircraft consistently exceeded German expectations for durability and effectiveness. Other German pilots, interviewed after the war, made similar observations, emphasizing that the P-47's firepower was devastating, that its ability to absorb damage was unprecedented, and that American pilots had learned to fly the aircraft in ways that maximized its strengths. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer, who was credited with 220 victories during the war, stated in post-war interviews that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Baer's comments reflected a broader recognition within the Luftwaffe that destroying a P-47 required either catastrophic damage to vital systems or sustained fire that combat conditions rarely allowed. German pilots learned to prioritize attacks on P-47 engines and cockpits, where concentrated fire might disable the aircraft or wound the pilot, but even these tactics often failed against the Thunderbolt's armor protection and structural strength. The production total for the P-47 exceeded 15,600 aircraft, more than any other American fighter type during World War II. Republic Aviation's facilities at Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, produced P-47s continuously from 1942 through 1945. The industrial capacity required to manufacture 15,000 complex fighters, each containing thousands of individual components, millions of rivets, and requiring hundreds of hours of skilled labor, represented a mobilization of resources that few nations could match. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts with shrinking industrial capacity and increasingly disrupted supply lines, could not produce fighters in quantities sufficient to replace combat losses and maintain force strength. American industry, protected by oceans from enemy attack and supplied with resources from across the Western Hemisphere, could build fighters faster than combat could destroy them. Colonel Neil Kirby did not survive the war to see the P-47's complete vindication. On March 5, 1944, 5 months after his Medal of Honor mission, Kirby led a 3-aircraft patrol over Wewak, the same area where he had achieved his greatest victory. He intercepted 3 Japanese bombers approaching Dagua airfield and attacked, destroying 1 bomber before a Japanese Ki-43 fighter engaged him from an unexpected angle. Kirby's P-47 was hit and crashed into the jungle. His wingman, Captain William Dunham, the same pilot Kirby had saved during the October engagement, watched Kirby descend under parachute, but could not confirm his survival. Kirby's body was not recovered until 1949. He was buried with full military honors at Sparkman Hillcrest Memorial Park in Dallas, Texas. His final tally was 22 aerial victories, making him the top-scoring P-47 pilot in the Pacific Theater. Alexander Kartveli continued working in aircraft design through the end of World War II and beyond. He led the team that developed the F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber that served with distinction during the Vietnam War. He also contributed to design work on the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a ground attack aircraft that carried forward many of the same design philosophies that had made the P-47 successful: rugged construction, heavy armament, pilot protection, and ability to survive battle damage. Kartveli never sought publicity for his contributions to military aviation. He worked quietly, focused on solving engineering problems rather than building personal reputation. When he died in 1974, most obituaries mentioned the P-47 only briefly, focusing instead on his later work and his status as an immigrant who had contributed significantly to American military aviation. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat missions in May 1945 as Allied forces completed the conquest of Germany and prepared for the final assault on Japan. When the war ended, most P-47s were quickly retired from service, replaced by jet aircraft that represented the future of military aviation. But the aircraft's legacy extended far beyond its combat record. The P-47 had demonstrated that heavy fighters built around powerful engines, concentrated firepower, and structural durability could dominate aerial combat despite lacking the maneuverability and lightweight that had defined fighter design throughout aviation history. The 850 caliber machine guns the German pilots had initially dismissed as inadequate compared to cannon armament had proven effective through volume of fire and reliability, exactly the characteristics that Alexander Kartveli had designed into the aircraft. The story of the P-47 is not a story of revolutionary technology or dramatic breakthroughs. It is a story of engineering pragmatism, of designing an aircraft around clearly defined requirements and accepting the compromises that those requirements imposed. It is a story of tactical doctrine developed through combat experience, of pilots who learned to fly a heavy, unconventional fighter in ways that maximized its strengths and negated its weaknesses. And it is a story of industrial capacity, of a nation that could design, build, and deploy 15,000 complex fighters while simultaneously producing bombers, transports, ships, tanks, and all the other materiel required to wage global war. When German pilots laughed at the P-47 in 1943, they were looking at an aircraft that violated every assumption about what made an effective fighter. By 1945, when those same pilots described the P-47 with respect and acknowledgement of its effectiveness, they had learned what American pilots already knew. 8 50 caliber machine guns, firing simultaneously, created firepower that could destroy any aircraft in seconds. Weight and size that handicapped maneuverability at low altitude became overwhelming advantages at high altitude, where thin air limited the performance of lighter fighters. And an aircraft designed to survive battle damage and bring its pilot home created confidence that translated into aggressive tactics and sustained operations that wore down enemy forces through relentless pressure. The P-47 Thunderbolt won the war not through elegance or innovation, but through systematic execution of a design philosophy that prioritized effectiveness over convention. It was a dinosaur with good proportions, exactly as Alexander Kartveli had promised. And like the great reptiles that once dominated Earth, it was perfectly adapted to its environment, overwhelming in its power, and ultimately displaced by a changing world that no longer required its particular combination of strengths. But for the 3 years when it mattered most, when the outcome of the war hung on aerial combat over Europe and the Pacific, the P-47 and its 8 50 caliber machine guns proved that American engineering and American industrial power could build weapons that would determine history's course. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.